Good evening. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the lecture series on Effacing a Culture of Extinction, Exploration of Green Philosophies and Representations. The Department of English, Martham College, Tiruvalla, with a rich legacy of 6 decades, organizes the Dr. A.V. Varughese Memorial Lecture regularly, featuring eminent speakers from across the globe. This year, the department is organizing a lecture series comprising 4 talks. On the 26th of November, that is today, Dr. R. Michael Fisher will deliver the Dr. A.V. Varughese Memorial Lecture. The second lecture will be on the 27th and will be delivered by Mr. G.M. Pillai. The third lecture on the 1st of December will be given by Dr. D.E. Bennett. The fourth and the final lecture on the 4th of December will be delivered by Dr. Raki Kalita Moral. Topics of contemporary relevance and critical interest have been chosen for the A.V. Varughese Memorial Lectures over the years. Years have witnessed a wide variety of critical inquiries into the areas of epics, culture, popular culture, regional literatures, comparative literature, and cinema. This year, interesting sessions centered around the focal point of ecology and literature will be aired. The position of environment in the power hierarchy and its representations in plays, films, texts, etc. will be looked into. As we proceed to the inaugural session of the A.V. Varughese Memorial Lecture 2020, let me welcome you all to this venture hosted by the Department of English, Martham College, Tiruvalla. Let us formally begin the inaugural session. A virtual rendition of a prayer song by our department choir will now be played as we invoke the blessings of the Almighty on our venture. Thank you. May I now call upon Dr. Ashley Susan Phillip, the head of the department, to formally welcome the audience. Ashley, miss, could you please unmute your mic?
Good evening to all. Established in 1966 as a department for undergraduate studies, the journey of this department to offering a postgraduate course in 1967 and a doctoral program in 1985 as a research department is a long one. The International Lecture Series is but one event that marks its growth over the years and has been possible due to the support and encouragement of the principal of the college, Dr. Varughese Matthew. Unfortunately, Sir has been able to attend this meeting right now. But anyway, we feel Sir's presence and his best wishes during the course of this program. In view of the enormous concerns and debates over climate change, the state of the environment, and of human existence in the present, it is perhaps appropriate that the keynote speaker for this year's Dr. A.V. Memorial Lecture is Dr. Michael Fisher, a scholar and practitioner of virology, an emerging transdisciplinary field. It attempts to teach people strategies of how to engage and deal with fear. In our contemporary historical context of a world gone into hiding due to the present pandemic, and the same world exercising violence and hate as it panics over terrorism's foreignness, or simply turning a blind eye to an already fragile ecosystem, Dr. Fisher's talk will surely enable us to see the world around us with different eyes. We are honored to have Dr. Fisher here and welcome you, Professor, to this lecture series. Today's talk has been made possible through the continuing interest of the Dr. A.V. Varughese Memorial Trust. I welcome Dr. A.P. John, member of the Trust and former principal of the Marthoma College, Tiruvalla, to this event. I also take the opportunity to greet other members of the Trust and the family of Dr. Varughese who are present here. To the conveners of the lecture series, Dr. Remy Cherian George and Sushmita Ann Varughese, there is no need of a formal welcome. You have been here from the time this event was a glimmer of an idea right up to its present blood and flesh moment. Nevertheless, welcome and best wishes. The department is what it is today due to the unconditional support and investments of its former faculty. I am so happy that they are here today and warmly welcome them. To my colleagues who have been working towards today for several weeks, this program would not have taken place without you, from its conception to its implementation. On a formal note, I welcome your presence here. An event to an extent is defined by its participants. My colleagues and I thank each one of you for showing interest in these lectures. We have an expert panel of scholars scheduled to speak in the coming days. Hope you will find the talks thought-provoking, informative, and enjoyable. Welcome to this program. Once again, on behalf of the Department of English, Marthoma College, Tiruvalla, I warmly welcome all of you to this lecture series. Thank you. Dr.
Our principal, Dr. Varughese Matthew, has been offering constant encouragement and guidance for all the efforts of the English department. Let me welcome Dr. Varughese Matthew for the formal inauguration of this lecture series and also to deliver the presidential address. We regret the inconvenience as Dr. Varughese Matthew is unable to join us at this moment due to certain technical glitches. We may get on to the next program. The department is grateful to the Dr. A.V. Varughese Memorial Trust for the constant support that they have been offering in organizing events of this stature over the past years. Today, we have Dr. A.P. John, a representative from the Dr. A.V. Varughese Memorial Trust, attending this meeting. Sir was the former principal of Mahatma College and also the former faculty member of the Department of English. We welcome you, sir, to this A.V. Varughese Memorial Lecture, and may I invite you to offer felicitations.
Good evening, everyone. I'm happy to be here with you for a few moments. I understand that the lecture of the main lecture is to begin in a few minutes. I congratulate, first of all, the English department for organizing this series of lectures facing a culture of extinction. And I'm happy that the first lecture in the series by Dr. Michael Fisher is in memory of Dr. A.V. Varughese, a great man, very dear to our hearts. Probably many of you have not seen him, but those who knew him understand him as a very genial, friendly person, someone who would okay. Hello? Am I audible?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Please continue.
Okay. Dr. Varughese would have been 90 this year had he not passed away about 37 years ago. And as when he passed away, he was the Vice Chancellor of Kerala University. But what we remember him more affectionately for is for what he has done for the English department of this college. He was singularly responsible for starting a postgraduate course in English in our college. And it is because of his efforts that from then on, we have progressed eventually into a research department and one of the main departments of the college. It is always in the right to remember the past and all those who have made it possible for us to enjoy the present. So I take this opportunity to pay homage to Dr. A.V. Varughese. He was my teacher, my colleague, and my Vice Chancellor. I'm very glad to be here saying a few words of appreciation and love to Dr. Varughese. And I understand that Dr. Varughese's family members are present with us in this Zoom platform. I greet them and wish them all very well. I wish the department and also this series of lectures well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. A.P. John, for giving us a brief recap of years and for telling us in detail about Dr. A.V. Varughese. We are so glad you could make it to the Zoom meeting. We are extremely sorry our principal, Dr. Varughese Matthew, sir, has not been able to enter the meeting because of certain technical glitches. Nevertheless, we will continue with our program. Dr. Remy Cherian George and Professor Susmita Ann Varughese serve as conveners of this international lecture series. As we move on to the A.V. Varughese Memorial Lecture, the first lecture of this series, may I request Dr. Remy Cherian George to introduce the speaker to us. Over to you, Remy.
A very good evening to all the attendees who have joined us today. The Department of English, Marthoma College, Tiruvalla, is happy to organize an international lecture on the topic Effacing a Culture of Extinction, Exploration of Green Philosophies and Representations. We have some exciting and enlightening lectures lined up today, tomorrow, on 1st and 4th of December, respectively, by reputed and learned resource persons. It is expected that the deliberations will touch upon diverse and multifarious stances that will enable all of us to gain valuable insights. We hope that the Dr. A.V. Varughese Memorial Lecture today and the other lectures coming up will make a substantial contribution to environmental thinking. Before we move on to the session, I would like to remind all the attendees to fill up the feedback form that will be circulated towards the end, and also to participate in the Q&A session by typing your questions in the chat box. It is an honor and privilege for me to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. R. Michael Fisher from the University of Calgary, Canada. Dr. Michael is an artist, philosopher, educator, and phenologist with a background career in wildlife biology, ecology, animal behavior, and environmental studies. His focus of research is primarily on motivational ecologies, especially the role of fear in systems. He has many books, hundreds of articles published, and is the founder director of In Search of Fearlessness Research Institute and the Fearology Institute. Despite his busy schedule, he has consented to grace the inaugural lecture today and deliberate on the topic ecology and fear, or fear and ecology. So over to you, Dr. Michael, and wish you a bright morning. Hello, Dr. Michael, am I audible? Dr. Michael, can you please unmute yourself?
All right, I guess I have to do it. I thought maybe you did it.
Okay.
I'm also going to share a screen, and so I have a PowerPoint. Just make sure you give me permission, but that'll just be in a minute or two. Okay, so first of all, I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to be doing a memorial lecture, and I have to say that it is a question that comes to my mind is, why is it that, you know, I am giving my first major lecture to a university college in another part of the world from Canada, from North America? And it's not surprising. I think by the end of this talk, you will understand. I feel like I'm living in a philosophical diaspora here in North America. I feel like perhaps my ancient soul is actually much more from the East. But I have to live where I am in the West, and a very long time. So before on the internet, which is Dr. Rayson Alex, he apparently is one of the students from your university college. And then I want to say, I want to appreciate that Carola is come on my mind, on my radar over the years. My wife is also a scholar in feminist studies and interfaith studies. And one of the things she told me several years ago, and it stuck in my mind, was Carola is a very unique part of the world. I certainly maybe don't have to tell you who are there that fact, but she said it was one of the most historically interfaith cultures, communities, area, geographically, etc., and historically. And, that was for her something. Actually, she spent some time studying what had gone on in Kerala's history for that interfaith. And I think that is also a good sign for what I'm going to be talking about today, is certainly that kind of interspiritual, interfaith embrace and, integration is so important to, in a sense, really undermining the domination of fear and fear-based ways of living. So thank you and congratulations to the history of Kerala as an area for that. So why an English department is interesting to me. I'm going to be talking, I'll put the PowerPoint up in a second here. I'm going to be talking about eco-criticism was a topic that was suggested to me. And that is how literary criticism analyzes and looks at fear and those relationships between the two is what I'll be looking at. So I'm going to share screen now. Just give me a moment here to get this. I'm not too used to it. What happened there? Okay, and I'll just get on the, so hopefully you can all see that. Yeah. And I'm just going to move this away, out of the way. Okay. So first of all, I wanted to introduce with a few stories that a little bit about my background. And I really come to eco-criticism, which is really the connection of art and nature in two ways. So this is how I come to it. Let's walk through a few stories. As a young little boy, I was immediately taken into a lot of natural environments thanks to my father. Even though we were working poor class, he always went fishing and made sure that we got lots of experiences in nature. And eventually I became quite a nature lover. And one of the things that I do when I was out fishing and hunting and with my dad is I would always sit down and spend that quiet time in nature. And something occurred to me over the many years, even as a young person. I would say by 14, 15, I was starting to really ask myself questions about why is human societies, at least as I experienced, so neurotic? And why did I not see that same neuroses of qualities of, behaviors and attitudes in nature? So that started making me ask questions, what happened between nature and culture? Now, as an artist, this is one of my paintings way back from the 1980s. I became a wildlife painter as part of my also entering into wildlife ecology studies. I was also always interested in art. And what I learned to do in that process of moving from nature into art and art into nature was I really had the chance to explore detail. And that's something that you do. You learn the patience of a fisherman sitting at the edge of the river and fish aren't biting. And you have to start observing and entertaining yourself. And I just started looking at everything in fine detail. And that became very useful for my artwork to do these kinds of art pieces. And then the other thing, as I said, there's a sort of peacefulness. And I showed these two images just to give us a sense of the kind of peacefulness that tends to come from nature. Not that I'm saying nature is in by any ways all benign. Nature is definitely challenging. Nature has its own destructive forces and its own will in a sense. But that calm and peacefulness was something that I sought, and I sought it in my body. I could feel that I felt calm in the natural landscape. And that's important when we're going to be talking about the topic of fear. But I also watched in nature that, and this is from a drawing I did in the 80s as well, is that there are predators. In fact, nature, if you look at the fundamental principles, it is operating on who's eating who and who's escaping from who. So there's this love that I developed in the natural and the observational. And the love because it made me feel good. Nature made me feel loved. I love nature. And I found it much harder to love human beings. I found it much harder to love culture in that sense. So I put in the predator here on the right side as a demonstration of nature is also basically an ecology of predator and prey relations. So that will come back later. Okay, next slide. I'm just going to talk a bit about my brief, well, basically in 1989, I started a full-time kind of career, and that was through a very powerful experience I won't have time to go into. 1989, I had a discovery that basically fear is what conditions me, it conditions relationships, and love is more or less sacrifice. So that study, informally, I was not in a university at that time, but I had finished my, environmental careers and I was switching into education. So that's really important to know that really fundamentally, I think as an educator, I think as an artist, obviously, and I also think as a scientist. And I thought I'd show this slide of making a fearologist, which is a word that had been around and I've kind of played with it. And then now it's sort of become more and more serious. So we're talking about 31 years of my thinking about this work. So my research trajectory when I went to university, which was much later, but even before university, I started collecting all these cards, and I was making these cards on basically what are called fear quotes. And here's an example of one. So I have boxes and boxes full of these, and this was just my way of doing research. So what I was doing is I was just going to any book, any articles I was reading and finding, and again, across disciplines, more or less. And I would look at quotes like this, and I would write them all down. I would organize them and categorize them so I could try to find patterns. Now, that's what scientists do. You collect data, you collect specimens. And so I had this idea as a scientist, I was going to collect specimens of how humans talk about fear. And that's across cultures, history, across disciplines, popular culture. It didn't matter. I said, it's a specimen of how people talk about fear. I said, from the study of those, I might start to learn. So this is just one methodology I used. And then when I went to university in 2003 for graduate school, I ended up more or less sorting into categories and disciplines rather than just these cards. And I have boxes and boxes of these folders full of what I call the patterns of discourse hegemony. In other words, what dominates is what I was asking. What is the dominant way of talking, thinking, imagining what fear is and how we manage fear? So as an educator, at that time I was doing a PhD in education, I was asking myself, are educational systems in general, and I was certainly looking at the West, North America primarily, are we adequately informing ourselves as adults, as educators, and therefore our students and our societies? Is socialization, is the educational systems actually sufficiently and adequate to what I will be talking about today is the fear problem? And so what I noticed in discourse hegemony is basically I'm studying texts, I'm studying what the discourse is behind those texts, and discourse is a very complex term. I won't go into it today, but it's how do we form knowledge and power about fear? Okay, so I'm actually much more interested in the discourse of text than I am actually interested in the bio-neurological, psychological. I'm interested in that too, but I'm interested in the sociological function of knowledge and power. And what I say is how fear gets distributed, reproduced, and maybe in good ways, yeah, some of that discourse and text that I've collected, you can imagine I have tens of thousands of these samples. But I'm just going to suggest that there's some real problems I found. And I'll go through a little bit of that today. So let's go to eco-criticism just for a moment. I'm going to show you a slide to just kind of get our brain thinking and imagining about a possibility. So here's my artist at work here. So I was interested in what are the primary global pollution dangers. Well, one of the ones that's arisen in the last, certainly since I was environmental studies in 1970s, when I first went into reading ecology, already the greenhouse effect, global warming, was already well recognized in environmental studies. So we're talking early 70s, even before that. But this was not a new problem. But it was only, within probably the last decade that it really, came to the foreground. Al Gore's film, An Inconvenient Truth, in 2004 brought CO2, carbon dioxide, to the present. And what he was showing, it was graphs of, the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere over history and time has increased and increased with civilization's development. Human, there are not other factors, of course, for carbon dioxide changes in points, of concentration. However, human made or human originated carbon dioxide, and certainly with the Industrial Revolution, was a major factor. So I had this analogy. This is what I'm sharing with you in this slide. The analogy was, I said, well, I think from my point of view, I'm going to put fear as an analogy of carbon dioxide. And the reason it's so an interesting analogy is that carbon dioxide is absolutely natural. It's actually totally what we do. We breathe out carbon dioxide. Plants take in carbon dioxide, give off oxygen in this wonderful system, in balance. But once the concentrations of carbon dioxide, in other words, too much of a good thing, right, even too much of a natural thing, starts to become toxic. I thought about fear. Okay, fear, many of us would argue, and many of those discourses say fear is natural. Fear is something that we need for, alerting our system biologically, psychologically, to deal with threat and possible risks. But the problem is that I also was just marking out a trajectory that you could probably argue that fear has also increased in concentration in the generic psychological cultural sphere, if you want. Not just the physiosphere like carbon dioxide, but in the mind sphere, the sphere of the noosphere, and you could even say even in the spiritual world. So then I became interested in why is this rise, increase? We know what carbon dioxide has caused, what's caused carbon dioxide to increase so intensely. But I said, well, what about fear? What do we know historically about fear? Of course, the historians will often say, well, we should probably, they'll tell me, don't be so worried. Fear's not so bad now, man. Can you just think about living in the Middle Ages? Can you just think about living, where you could be suffering from diseases? We don't have medicine. So that became a huge argument, right? The problem of, well, is fear actually increasing or not increasing? And I'm not going to go into the history of fear. There's a whole literature on history of emotions nowadays, historians, history of fear itself. Many people are writing books on that. That's interesting. But I also want to say, I'm not going to get caught in how historians, number one, how they define fear. Now, I'm transdisciplinary, as I said, as a fearologist, so I don't get caught in reading fear through only and interpreting it through only one lens, one discipline. So keep that in mind as we just kind of walk through this slide presentation. So I became interested in when fear started to really increase. And I think at that red arrow there that you see, I'm going to call that probably the time when humans moved in their evolutionary cycle from hunters-gatherers to agriculturalists, horticulturalists. And there are various literatures available by archaeologists, feminist archaeologist scholars that I'm interested in. When we moved from a participation culture or a cooperative culture overall in our evolutionary systems, we're talking 10 to 12,000 years ago, to that shift around 10 to 12,000 years ago, we became mainly agricultural. And what we see are trajectories within cultural evolution of more and more dominator cultures. So I'm quoting the work of Rianne Eisler here, paraphrasing. And she said one of the two main factors of that change from, participatory cultures to more dominator cultures was that fear and mistrust in the dominator culture are primary agents for power and domination, rather than so much cooperation. Not saying cooperation still isn't going on in those cultures and even now, but it starts to become fear and mistrust as actually deriving from and often from power elites within those cultures. So I basically said from that kind of time forward, now the orange arrow, fear was increasing, that's post 9/11. So that's what that arrow represents. And I'll just move this diagram so I can kind of see what my thing is. Okay. So 9/11, I thought, was, when I was in graduate school, I said, this is a pivotal historical moment. This is not only historical, this is like an evolutionary moment. Now, I might be exaggerating that, but that's my case. And really because there was a very unique symbolic, sociological, political structuration that came out of North America and out of America per se, the United States, through the president's announcement that they would now classify that after 9/11, that the United States was going to enter a preemptive war, preemptive and also reactive war against basically all terrorism. And they called it the War on Terror. I collected discourses again. I'm very fascinated by how we shape stories and narratives. And of course, literary criticism is also interested in that. And the politics behind it, the psychology behind it. And that war on terror was basically, wow, humans, okay, so here's my quick take. Humans finally came to the realization after post 9/11, and I'm not saying this is a good, way that they did it in the United States in their declaration as a government. But what they came to is that war on fear. Of course, terror just being the extreme of fear. And I said, wow, here we now have humans talking about a war on fear. In other words, humans are so terrified is a general background that they've now are going to take a war out on fear, right? So here we have the problem of fear as a motivator trying to solve the problem of fear, i.e. terrorism is one characteristic example or exemplar of how fear manifests. Okay, so I'll just go through those. So I think a culture of extinction, as this program, your conference is about, is related to a culture of fear. And that's supposed to be in the slide, but right now my PowerPoint is not advancing. I'm not sure why. Seems stuck. Let me just try and... Oh, there we go. Okay, so I basically argued that if we want to look at primary global pollution dangers, fear is the problem. Fear creates a toxicity that is way above and beyond. And using this diagram, I'm now going to go into a little quick theory of how I understand this relationship in an integral perspective. And I'm going to use this word and define integral, why I use an integral methodology. So first of all, this rise in carbon dioxide, I'm going to call the eco problem. And I'm talking again, global here, evolutionary. I think our human species has to deal with this problem or we're in big trouble. And we're starting to, right? That's the whole green movement, right? Which is part of your green philosophies analysis that's going on. And the next part, when we put fear together in the story of trying to solve major global problems, I call that the ego problem. So this is going to be an idea that is going to move into the next slides, and you're going to see why I'm putting them together. But just hang in with me slowly here. First of all, look at eco and ego here, capital E, not as in just ecological and not as in just egological. In other words, I'm getting beyond just psychology and I'm getting beyond just science. I'll show you where I'm going. I was interested in 1999, a book came out called The Ecology of Fear. I've never seen that term ever used before. Again, I studied discourses on fear for 30 years. When ecology got mixed with fear as an actual ecology of fear. And Mike Davis comes out of urban studies and a cultural studies background. And he was really looking at the combinations of eco problems in the Los Angeles area of North America, one of the major cities in the West Coast, and how fear seems to influence not only fear as a reaction to the environmental problems they have, but fear then breeds and constructs those very ecological and environmental problems at the same time. So you had a cycle here of the eco and the ego problem interacting and reinforcing each other. And it creates such a complexity of problem. That's why it's really intractable to solve. It's what some people have called a wicked problem. We need to look at some problems are more than just problems. They are wicked problems. So eventually, bringing this eco perspective and ego perspective together, I'm suggesting is a future way of thinking and imagining our major global problems. So we don't want to just look at eco by itself. We also want to look at the fear problem with it and an integrated. So I call this a critical integral a-perspectival methodology. A-perspectival is a term that's basically, it's called vision logic sometimes. It's like sort of a next level of consciousness above rational consciousness, as some developmentalists have argued in evolutionary people or evolutionary psychology. And basically it says, don't pick any one perspective, look at all perspectives. In other words, don't be always favoring your bias in one perspective of understanding problems. We need to look at larger problems. Okay, so let's go now to the next slide. Just move this out of the way for a moment. Okay. Next slide, basically I'm saying is that eco-criticism, when I've gone on the internet and looked at some of the ways eco-criticism is being taught, and I'm not an expert in eco-criticism, but it's when literary studies basically brought in ecological issues and took an ethical perspective on literary criticism. And it had this idea, that fear is important. Eco-criticism, you could find it in some of the literature of eco-criticism. However, what you couldn't find was very much emphasis on. They would say fear is an emotion, fear is a factor, a psychological factor, fear is natural, but fear is also constructed. And they said that becomes a problem. So some eco-criticism, you'll find some of that issues going on. Again, I'm not sure why my PowerPoint's not working there in that moment. There we go. Okay, so ecology and fear. You can see basically ecology in eco-criticism is much more important than the concept of fear. That's why I made fear smaller in letters here. And that's not, to me, a good thing, because I'm looking at now, eco-criticism has its own discourse hegemony. And like any criticism, any discipline, it can get into its own bias, its own perspectivism, rather than an a-perspectivism. And that discourse or domination of ecology over fear, I think, is a problem. So that's a big point in my lecture today. The eco view by itself does not give fear enough. Except one area started to interest me in just the last few years. Probably 2 or 3 years ago, I became aware of the work of Simon Estock, an eco-criticism scholar. And he had written a book on ecophobia and many articles. I said, now there is something that interests me, because as someone interested in fear, now eco is being connected with phobia. And he was arguing in his work that eco-criticism needs to look at ecophobia as a major universal construct. And I'll give a few examples of how you could do that. Basically, fear of nature. So ecophobia is a type of phobia, a fear of nature itself. Eco representing, in a sense, nature, but eco, of course, is much bigger than nature as far as I'm concerned. However, that ecophobia, when I started reading that literature, and many people are getting into it now with his leadership and others, they're basically still constructing fear, constructing the definition, the meaning, the imaginary fear, still in very what I call traditional psychological terms. and as an emotion, as a factor. And so I wasn't seeing the big change. So I said, okay, now they're at least the eco concern, eco criticism is bringing in phobia. So there's the ego component that I showed in the last slide. Aha, there it is. I'm starting to snoop, it's coming out. And then I asked myself, well, why don't we have something called ego criticism? Which would be, and you can think of it however you want, but it's the psychological aspect of how ego, and that's, again, small ego, but there's a bigger ego, which I'll go into a little bit, but that's not the point of this talk. And ego criticism would look at fear. And that's my whole point of eco and ego. Let's look at that ecology plus the fear. And so Desh Suba, coming out of Nepal, was a literary writer, poet, scholar. He now lives in Hong Kong. And I met him in 2014. And Desh Suba wrote a book called Philosophy of Fearism, and it was all about how fear conducts life, directs life. Life is controlled by fear. And he, in 1999, came up with this idea that fearism is a concept that we might want to use in literary criticism. So that was very exciting. And I saw him on the internet. I think he contacted me and we said, wow, we have some very similar interests in making fear a foundational construct for actually understanding all human activity, nature, reality. So it's kind of an ecology of fear of entire human activity. And of course, you could even go beyond humans to bring fear in. So then he and I wrote a book where we did an East-West dialogue. So I said, well, you come from an Eastern perspective. I don't come from a literary perspective, but I come from a fearologist perspective. So I'm going to write this book with you. I led the project, and he was happy to have me, write with him. English is not his first language, so his English translations of his work, and I recommend his book, Philosophy of Fearism, but it's not a good translation. And he couldn't afford to get a really good one, so it's got problems. So I was trying to use this next book in 2016 to upgrade that. So again, just some dates on to give you a sense of how this fearism idea has been developing for a long time. And just to let you know, I use fearism also like terrorism. So I use it in two ways. Fearism is just a philosophy or a lens on how to look at reality, life, and eco-criticism, obviously. But then I also was using fearism back even earlier, in 1990. I started using it a bit in my writing as I said, well, terrorism is easy to understand as a concept. But what is underneath terrorism that is building up, accumulating, right? Just like my diagrams, it's accumulating, that causes terrorism as the big explosion of fearism. So I was using fearism as fearism in a toxic form that was building and building to where terrorism is. And I was basically saying, how come we have all this talk about terrorism, we don't have any talk about fearism? So that was 1990, I was thinking about that. So just to end this slide before I go on the next, you can see once you bring in a philosophy of ego criticism here, philosophy of fearism is one approach. I'm not saying this is the only approach to ego criticism, but I think it would be very useful to recalibrate the balance there between fear and ecology. So that's why the title of my talk was Ecology and Fear, or should we be? And this is the ought to be, the should be, the philosophical question. Maybe we ought to be looking at fear a little bit more and putting ecology even secondary for a while, because we've put ecology so much first, fear second. Fear has not advanced conceptually, in my view, under the ecology banner. So that's a real claim I'm making right now, that we need a fearological perspective, a philosophy of fearism. Again, that's a long, complex, whole other lecture on what is a philosophy of fearism. But you get the idea of what I'm trying to transition here. And so you can see, basically I'm saying an eco approach plus an ego approach in criticism would lead to me, in my view, they would lead to us understanding the fear matrix, what I call how human societies since at least 12,000 years, but maybe before, there's been that rise. So on my last slide, and I invite lots of questions after for sure, the last slide is basically fearism. So using the philosophy of fearism, Suba and myself. What's our challenge here to literary criticism and eco-criticism? In general, fearism presents a case for a very epistemological reevaluation of the nature and role of fear, and how do we know fear? How do we come to know? How good is our knowledge and knowing about fear itself? So that's one of the things fearism brings. It brings a real critical perspective, a reflective perspective, a transdisciplinary perspective to analyzing those discourses, what I call discourse hegemonies, that dominate the field of understanding and imagining what fear is. And, just for one quick example, there's an interesting researcher in education that is my field in critical education, Peter McLaren, and he raised in 1995, this was, before 9/11, he said, there is right now, in my view, an arising in American culture, he was specifically looking at, in 1995, an arising of a hyper-real new species of fear. I'm quoting him. Wow, that language is very interesting to me. A hyper-real new species of fear arising in North America. And I think, that's spreading around the globe like a virus, to use the phrase. And that starts to make me think maybe we don't understand fear as well as we think we do. Is that one of the reasons, right? This is just a question, a hypothesis. Maybe if our epistemology, our ways of knowing about fear are actually quite inadequate to the actual increasing concentration of fear and the impact it's having on humanity and on the planet and its ecological systems. Okay, so that creates an ethical issue as well. When is fear actually an ethical concern? Not just a psychological problem, not just a biological problem that we can treat with pharmacological, interventions or other kinds of interventions that are more materialistic. I get to the philosophical issue of perhaps fear, in this reconstruction, right, this fearism reconstruction, a fearological reconstruction, fear is actually a pivotal ethical issue. And until we bring that into actual social behavior, to cultural behavior, to our world views that we operate in organizational development, governance, policy, without making fear and good fear education primary, I think it's an ethical issue. We could actually be undermining ourselves as a species and many species on this planet into an extinction, basically collapsing scenario. And I know this conference is about challenging some of that collapsing narrative, which I agree, we need to challenge it. So the other issues, I'll just go through them briefly. Collaboration, fearism challenges us to be more collaborative in understanding fear. One of the things I try to have conversations with is people from all disciplines. I want to be able to talk about fear with anybody from any discipline. Now, whether I can do that or not, or do it well, that's another question, but that's one of my challenges. That's a transdisciplinary perspective. I ought to be able to have those dialogues with all people from physiology, biophysiology, all the way up to theology. That should not be a problem. That should be a synthesis and an interway, a transdisciplinary way of gaining better knowledge about fear and its management and education. And legitimation issues, fearism challenges anybody who basically says, well, fearism hasn't established a track record, which it hasn't. It doesn't belong in a research university. It doesn't have degrees. It's all made up. We're basically artists, Suba and I, and we're making up these terms because we think the language is even inadequate in the way we speak and think and imagine about fear. So we're just adding our own language, but I think all creative people throughout history have done this. And, whether it's legitimate or not is, of course, a question. And I agree. I don't say that everything we know or the conjectures we make are even accurate. They may need to change. So the last one is existential issues in a collapse psychology. I am very convinced that we have to change our, views. So I talk about a couple of different things. And in this talk, because I don't think I have much time left, just to summarize, a meta-motivational theory I have, which starts on a basis of an ecology of fear, And that is that predator-prey relationships. We have to understand that that is a major motivator of all living things, human beings included. We are still, in many ways, basically animals, but we are very unique and amazing animals. And yes, we even have a spiritual nature as well. However, we're still on a primary foundational level motivated by an ecology of fear. Then I say we're motivated by an ecology of love above that. And then we're motivated by an ecology of freedom. So that I arc out, that movement, those basic meta-motivational, templates really for understanding human behavior. That's another lecture, of course. But I argue those are a fearlessness perspective. And now that I'm talking to people in the East, I'm so happy to talk to you because in the East, I have found more literature, more writing and thought and about fearlessness than anywhere else in the world. So, when it comes to the West, they're just not interested in, basically fearlessness. And in fact, the clinical psychologists they label fearlessness as a disease. They make it a clinical psychological syndrome. And I say, well, okay, that's fine, but that's a very narrow definition of fearlessness. Fearlessness has a very long trajectory. And, for any of you that know Abhaya Anadana in the Sanskrit tradition, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, Abhaya Dana, it's the gift tradition, the gift of fearlessness tradition. So there's quite a fascinating literature on looking at Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism that I had found back in the late 90s on the gift of fearlessness culture and philosophy. And that doesn't surprise me. The Bhagavad Gita, one of the things it says is the virtue of all virtues. There's a section in the Bhagavad Gita. Again, I'm not an expert in these, so you can see I just pick out certain things that I find interesting in discourses. Fearlessness in the Bhagavad Gita, it says, is virtue of all virtues. It does not say love is the virtue of all virtues. It's not discarding love, and it's important, but it doesn't put it as a virtue. Love is more an ontological reality. And the practice of coming to love, to live love, is the practice of fearlessness. And it's a practice of a gift of fearlessness, which is basically not letting fear control my life as best I can, and then not dumping that fear and trying to control others by the use of fear and misuse of fear. Okay, so I think that's lots. If there are any questions, I'd be glad to entertain those as best I can.
So thank you, Dr. Michael, for your erudite and enlightening lecture. Our chat boxes are flooded with positive comments, and I'll just read out some of the questions that the attendees have put. The first question is by Hamadullah from Karachi, Pakistan. He's asking, how can we overcome the global pollution?
Global pollution on the exterior. We have to deal with certain things that are physical and real. We have to reduce pollutions from industries, excessive uses of, materialism that is, people are driven by, quote, greed, which I still say greed is fear-based itself. I don't think anybody's greedy because that's natural. I think it's because they're afraid. And they're afraid at levels that are often unconscious. So that's where I come now, the global pollution of fear itself, the fear problem. They're intricated because the motivation for ecological and pollution is, I would argue, a fear-based motivation. And once we deal with that fear in a much better way, and as I say, even move along this path of fearlessness toward a love-based, cooperative-based living, we will really solve major pollution problems on the planet.
Okay, Dr. Michael, the second question is, can fearism concerned with ecology be taken on a mass scale as ecological trauma?
Yeah.
I'll repeat. Okay.
Yeah, no, I got it. Wonderful. It's a word I didn't introduce today. Because, you know, fear, as I said, is in some ways you could say it's natural and it's not a problem. For other species, it's not a problem. That's what my natural ecological background, my animal behavior background shows, is natural wild animals are not neurotic in general. They just aren't. And then you come into human civilization and we got these really neurotic, fear-based operating constantly on a fear-based, even though it can be very subtle sometimes, that fear-based. So what has happened to that human civilizational trajectory? What has happened to our species as a creature that was not in its original state? And many indigenous cultures, even way back, arguably, were not in that state. They were not neurotic in that same way we are today, you know, constantly looking in under threat. Our whole systems are so on a hyper level. Well, it's because we've been traumatized, and we've been traumatized quicker than we can heal the traumas. So that would just be a quick theory of explanation for that rise of the fear cycle I showed in the slide. It would be because of accumulating trauma. That would be a causal argument that one could make. And in simple language, because humans get hurt. And we get hurt a lot easier because we're so sensitive with this really complex brain. And we go into all kinds of imaginations of being hurt again. And how do we prevent being hurt again? Other creatures without this real big brain, they get hurt. They go through a little healing process, automatic and instinctually, and then they get on with life. Humans have a huge memory and a complex forebrain which holds ideas. Well, what would this happen? What possibly? That is the post-traumatic condition. And then we get triggered and then we react. And a lot of those traumatic reactions, even though you could say, well, they're sort of natural, they sort of are, but they can be very destructive because they're not in touch with reality very well. I think eco-criticism as a literary investigation, or just fearology as an investigation, is to help us understand better how to get back in touch with reality that isn't constantly invaded, right, and formed and constructed within a fear-based post-traumatic construction.
Harsha Vincent has a question for you. Sir, can you suggest some examples of literatures from the Western context in which we can trace fearism?
Sure. This book will help. Certainly, it's my work. This is 25 years of work, you know, to put this book together in 2010. So I basically put a theory together on the world's fearlessness teachings, and that was also a theory of fear management education. And you can see I'm looking at a critical, integral perspective there to fear management education, 21st century. I wish this was a textbook in every school, everywhere. Of course, it's complex and it's an academic, but it does give a theory of why I have seen that humans have many fear management strategies, just like animal species. And I marked out kind of from the most simple to the complex, and I'll just give you a very overview. There is a fear management system when we're in the womb. And it's not called that, you know, and we're not conscious of it, but the child is in a no fear state. And that's fear management 0, I call it. Fear management 1 is after we're born, we come into this world, we have to deal with all kinds of possible threats, get cold, loud noises, all kinds of things. And we have to develop this instinct, next fear management system, which is around bravery. So I'm analyzing, you know, people will use those terms in different ways, but I'm doing it in a very specific theory. And it's a theory based on consciousness development and evolution. The next after bravery is courage or courageousness. And that's more interior. Again, I don't have time to explain each of these. And then after that, I go to fearlessness. And after that, fearless is the highest possible. So I'm looking at human potential on these basic fear management systems, going from an a-dual to a dualism to a non-dualism. So I track and a lot of people have written about this evolution of consciousness, and I track out fear management systems that go with that theory of consciousness. I'm just thinking it might be a good map. right? That would guide us to see there's more than one way to manage fear. There's actually different fear management systems that have evolved through time. They're accessible to us, but you have to be able to know they're accessible. If you don't have the map, you don't even know where to go. You're just doing what you learn from your parents, from your culture, and that may not always be the best fear management system for the conditions you have to deal with.
Mary Roshni has a question. How do the philosophy of fear influenced the environmental restoration? How does it influence the environmental restoration? The philosophy of fear.
It probably doesn't. That would be my answer. I wish I knew more examples of that it does influence the restoration, reclamation ideas. And one of the reasons is, I think, ecology, right? The very understanding of defining ecology and environmental studies. It doesn't tend to look at the interiority of human experience very well. It's starting to now. But it hasn't traditionally, it's tried to be a science, and a science of empirical and generally a material bias. It's eco-oriented and not so ego-oriented. And that's a huge challenge to me. Of the question would be is, when is our eco-criticism, when is our eco-restoration projects, our eco-policies, our green policies, the green plan, the Green New Deal, whatever that language and those plans are, those designs, I keep asking, what if we actually in those designs are actually making those designs from a fear-based place? What if epistemologically they are problematic? I'm not saying, oh, that's horrible, throw it all out. No. I'm just saying, what if? Are we going to ask that question in our ecological restoration? Are we going to use a philosophy of fearism as even a possibility for informing ecological philosophies? And so far, not seeing it.
Okay, Dr. Michael. Maumita Sandra has a question. Sir, can you elaborate on greed as fear?
Yeah, I know. I have a tendency to basically reduce all negative human behaviors to a fear-based structure of motivation. I tend to do that. I'm not saying that's a good thing necessarily, but greed, it generally comes out of, arguably, a deficit experience. I did not get enough of something I wanted or needed. And in that lack, right, of not getting, that experience is recorded as a shortage. It's like instinctual, it's unconscious for the most part. And so when you come from that kind of place, and I'm going to argue even that's a traumatic place of not getting enough food, not getting enough love in the way that you wanted to get it, right? Or thought you deserved to get it. So any kind of act of that deficit, of that lack, is read, I would argue, interpreted as a sense of betrayal of what I thought was a human right, a right of myself and my dignity. And so not getting in that, and of course that happens. It happens all over the place because a lot of people don't care about you. They care about them. But what that leads to is a mentality of deficit kind of worldview that's unconsciously built and psychologically reinforced in a hurting or traumatic kind of condition. And that deficit will lead you to, when you see the opportunity to get something you want, I'm going to get more of it than I need. I'm going to get more to save for tomorrow, or more so I can keep it away from other people getting it. All arguably a fear-based structure that started to come, and that has a cultural history from when I mentioned 10 to 12,000 years ago. There's some arguments when we move from a participatory gift culture to a dominating scarcity culture. That's a huge and important archaeology we need to understand about the human species. So it's not just a personal problem, greed. It is a cultural and it is an evolutionary problem. And why did agriculture happen? Well, a lot of good reasons, and it created some really pathological neurotic conditions, which is create more, save it for the next year, keep it away from others. And of course, once you start keeping it, then people are going to come after you and get your supplies when they're short. It's the beginning of conflict and violence and domination of fear.
Dr. Shafna Harris has a question. Sir, can you please suggest some steps to overcome or tackle fear?
Yeah, it's a good question asked all the time, and I'm not going to answer it like a psychologist would. I'm going to answer it as a philosopher. Go out and study fear. Not just your own psychological fear. And when you go out and study it, don't just go to one source. There's lots of books, there's lots of articles, there's lots of YouTubes. Go and look at many and start to ask yourself, don't just take one. I think that's one of the biggest problems of people solving fear. And the reason is because fear is not just your problem. Your fears are not just your problem. They are a social problem. They are a cultural problem. They are given as on a philosophy. So to do and try and improve your management of your fear, just to think about, okay, if I go out and want to improve, how I manage fear, I'm doing this for the entire world, for the species, the good of the planet. It's not just about me and my little ego and self. So that is how I would approach it as a philosopher, as a fearologist.
PC Matthew has a question. Is the fear factor on the increase, or has it always been the same? How can fear be reduced? Is it to be tackled on an individual level or on a wider way?
So I have kind of answered the last part of that question. Fear has always been a factor. The question becomes, when has fear moved from just fear as a natural response to when fear became what I put on little quote marks, scare marks, fear, and that's toxic fear. And it's fear that is in this constant morphing, and in a sense, it's hiding itself. That's a whole different kind of fear that we're dealing with now. It's cultural now. It's accumulated. It's collective. And not only that, it's technological. So, there are books, for example, on the architecture of fear, the geography of fear, the ecology of fear. See, it's no longer just enough to think about fear as just the psychology of fear or the biology of fear. That's really the point of my lecture, in introducing that into eco-criticism and into our lives as humans. And I also want to say another thing is that on that is, if you look at fear and how you want to improve your management of it, we have a problem right from the beginning. And the argument is an epistemological problem. We're already afraid of fear. How can you study something you're already afraid of? How is your fear of fear itself? The famous quote by F.D. Roosevelt in 1931, his inaugural United States presidential election. He says, in the Depression, Americans, we have to understand we have a fear of fear itself. Very famous quote. Many other philosophers before him had used that kind of quote and language. The problem was, it shows us fear is not that simple. It is incredibly complex. Respect it, be humble, and explore many methodologies to how you want to understand fear. And then the last part is really pay attention to. The Dalai Lama had this wonderful phrase. He was teaching this in the early 90s. Dalai Lama was going around North America, and he says, you in the West, he says, don't fear fearlessness. And he was right. I mean, I've analyzed this for 30 plus years. He was exactly right. We are afraid of even fearlessness. And it's been taught to us to be afraid of fearlessness. But if you go to the ancient traditions, from the Bhagavad Gita to, Swami Vivekananda, who was the great Mahatma Gandhi, and had this great, the Satyagraha movement was based on fearlessness. It's an ethic. It's a living ethic. You see, it's not just about eliminating the feelings and emotions of fear. No. That's a very narrow psychobiological, very Western kind of materialistic view. So you see, expanding our vocabulary would be my overall prescription today. Expand your vocabulary and your imaginary on the nature of fear and its relationship to fearlessness. So I teach a dictum after that blue book I just showed of mine. I come up with just a simple dictum. This is what my years of research, 25 years, showed, is that when fear appears, so then does fearlessness. That's the dictum. And from remembering that, it also tells us immediately we're not victims. Yes, fear can be very negative, can be very destructive as well in its toxic forms. But when fear appears, so then does fearlessness. And the reason is because fearlessness is always correcting that toxicity of fear. It's called regulation, deregulation, re-regulation. It's physiologically, evolutionary built into us through the beginning of all life. But we pay attention more to fear symptoms, and we don't pay attention to the fearlessness arising because we haven't been taught to. The spirit of fearlessness, as I sometimes use, as many of the Eastern philosophers will call it, even a spirit of fearlessness, the gift of fearlessness. It's already there. It's a virtue ready to be practiced. See, it's not just about eliminating the feelings of fear. That's a very narrow perspective on fear management. So I'm talking about fear transformation, really. Wow, this is so great talking to you all. I don't get to have these kind of conversations, and I appreciate the quality of the questions.
Okay, Dr. Michael, I'll have a last question for you. So, what do you think of apocalyptic fear? How does it influence our vision of an ecocentric world?
Okay, could you repeat? I missed the first part. Just the transmission wasn't great.
What do you think of the apocalyptic fear?
What was that word? Apocalyptic?
APOCALYPTIC.
The politics of fear?
No, sir. It is apocalyptic.
Apocalyptic? Oh, apocalyptic?
Apocalyptic, yes.
Apocalyptic. Okay, thank you. Yeah. So read it again. Thank you. Rami, please.
Okay, so what do you think of the apocalyptic fear? How does it influence our vision of an ecocentric world?
Ecocentric or egocentric world?
Ecocentric world.
Ego?
Ecocentric world.
Ecocentric world? Well, yeah, that's what your conference, I guess, is about, isn't it? The apocalyptic imaginary, right? Sometimes called millennial fear. There's a whole literature on millennial fears. Historians have been tracking. And yeah, there seems to be something that happens in post-traumatic conditions, that accumulating trauma after trauma after trauma without us practicing the fearlessness, practicing the healing practices that are innate in us, learning only to cope. Eventually, when you keep getting hit by another trauma, another disaster, another act of terrorism, right, and so on, another crisis, you develop an apocalyptic psychology, I think, arguably. And that is a psychology that's exaggerated in this hyperfield, which is through spectacle, which is constructed through media reproductions. And then a massive kind of collective tapping into that field of knowledge, right, from media especially, where it's reproduced. Traumas and spectacles are reproduced. And after a while, it's just like the world, you become paranoid, and that's apocalyptic in a way. Another way would be, look, it's a type of paranoid patterning, a fear-based patterning that is set in and continues to reinforce. That's what you start looking for, right? Remember, instead of looking for fearlessness in the world, you're looking for the fear all the time. What's the next threat? And so how does that affect an eco view developing, right? And I think an eco view of the questioner is asking, and I interpret it possibly as true, an eco view is very positive. It's now going to get us back in touch with nature, the ecological laws and systems of how we operate. We want to work in more harmony and peace with those systems. However, we have this really difficult situation now where carbon dioxide, just being one example, natural things are now seen as toxins. Carbon dioxide. This is an unbelievable, to me, philosophical, cultural shift of perception. The sun, when I was in the 80s, it was the hole in the ozone, and now the sun rays are going to get through and they're going to cause cancer. We had a huge scare in the 80s around it. I've always been very concerned, if we want a healthy eco view, we're going to have a healthy ego view with it. We're going to have to be able to deal with our fear of how we interpret the natural ecological world. Because now it appears, the very environment, coronavirus, COVID-19, a natural substance, arguably. There are conspiracy theories that say it's not natural. But if it is a natural virus, and there are other pandemics, and will be, now our nature itself is now being constructed continually. And eco-criticism deals with some of this literature, this narrative, this discourse. Now the natural environment is now a threat to us, our species. It's no longer, I can just enjoy nature, enjoy the sun, and go out and breathe some air. I have to wear a mask. I have to watch 6 feet away from. This is a huge, huge issue. I think it's great that it's come to us. We're in a crisis. We have to deal and try to understand, why is this happening? We're becoming afraid of fear, and ecophobia is one of the terms in eco-criticism. We're becoming phobic to the natural world. Okay, now construct that in the human psyche. We're becoming phobic to our own life being, because we are the ecological system. Not separate. That's the whole teaching of ecology. And it's a teaching of non-dual philosophies, fearlessness. Yeah, so it's a big problem, and I've just barely touched the surface of that question. Thank you.
Hello.
Hello.
Sir, can I have a small question?
Yeah.
So today there's so much of discussion on the Anthropocene, deep time. Everything is very dystopian and apocalyptic. Now, if as humans we are going to be haunted by this, don't you think that our creativity, narratives, writing, painting, all this would be hampered, and that would automatically reflect on nature also?
You say it'll be hampered. I'm not sure about hampered. That I would say it ought to be changed so that culture phenomenon, arts, right? This is what we're kind of focusing on here. Arts is really important in helping translate nature. Because we're such cultural beings, where most of us are living in urban centers. We're influenced by culture, architects of industrialism, digital world, and so on. So I would just say that we're in a good time for learning how to bring the arts of all kinds and the aesthetic dimension itself, the aesthetic dimension of reality and modes of knowing. I'm a big believer of that. And I do practice art as a healing, for example. Art is spontaneous creation making and healing processes and practices. There's many ways that the arts, including literature, new narratives. The danger is that the arts, and I think you're pointing to this perhaps too, sir, the arts can be corrupted. It can be marketed and brought in to be even weaponizing as a force, used by regimes of marketing, commercial systems, elite systems, and has been. We know that Hitler was a master at this, using the arts and mythology and music and poetry and all kinds of things to actually breed his corruption of a fear-based regime. Arts is corruptible. It's potentially corruptible, but it also has the potential to actually be the healing, a vehicle for the healing, for the trauma work. So that would just basically be my optimism. I'm not an optimist in a bright light kind of way. I am very aware since I was 20 or earlier that the world is in deep trouble in terms of sustainability, and the crisis we're in is real. However, that if I stick in a apocalyptic psychology, I'll be probably basically in survival mode, and that means I'll be against others. I'll be in a kind of greed and me survive, and whatever happens to them, I don't really care about that much, especially outside of my friendship circle, right? So this is where fearlessness is a new concept that you can see I was bringing in a meta-motivational theory. I think a whole new understanding. We have to understand how we're motivated, and basically a better education on fear itself. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
So, Dr. Michael, can I ask some more questions? In fact, the chat boxes are flooded with questions for you. Pramod S has a question. If we human beings are more spiritually evolved than Mac's terrestrial problem will vanish, including abnormality of humanity. What do you say on this matter?
So did I hear that first part was a spiritual evolution or advancement?
Yes, doctor. If we human beings are more spiritually evolved than Mac's terrestrial problem will vanish, including abnormality of humanity.
Well, I agree in general that probably is the case. It's a very generalizing thesis to make, and it needs to be examined critically, is what I would say. And one of the things, if we were to talk about the purpose and role of religion, obviously we cannot ignore that in our ecological dangers and problems and in our neuroses that we have. And I have no doubt that religions have amazing functions and good functions, just like culture does, and just like the arts do. And I also believe, and have good reasons to believe, and have thought about it a lot, read a lot, is that religious practices are one thing, religious institutions are another thing. And unfortunately, a lot of power institutions utilize fear to basically convert people to various positions of cosmologies, belief in worldviews, beliefs and values systems, and that ideology is susceptible in every kind of institution I have ever seen, and I believe that exists. Now, spiritual practices, as we know, even with all religions, they have an exoteric form of teachings and practices, and that's the more institutional, the norm, and then they have a mystical form. And all major religions have this difference, and they don't always get along together. The mystics are known to be not always accepted well by the norm institutions of power, because there's a politics to spirituality. There's a politics to religion. And so my view would be is great. Spirituality and development, yes. You noticed I gave a developmental idea, right? Trajectory for fear management systems. Yes, we can evolve to more conscious, higher consciousness, and that is very optimistic view. That's an optimistic map of how to move along that trajectory. The challenge and difficulty is we don't always know where we're at and how to go to the next level, which I argue is a path of fearlessness. Less and less fear-based. And fearlessness, by definition, in the simple definition, I have many definitions in that book, as you saw in Fearlessness, it is a spiritual shift. And I'm going to use spiritual in quotes, but I think it is worth calling it a spiritual shift beyond just a cultural shift. Or, from a biological world to a cultural world, right? Natural to a cultural to, I think, a spiritual dimension. So I kind of use the cosmology of those three major dimensions, and they're all interrelated. Natural world, cultural world evolves, and the spiritual world evolves from the cultural. And the spiritual world is correcting the problems of how culture interprets nature. So that's my little quick definition. That would be a whole other lecture. But you can see that my work does have a sense of a spiritual evolution and development, both on the individual level and the collective level. Much more easier to develop spiritually and evolve. Very difficult to get the collective to evolve and develop spiritually to higher levels and fear management systems. That's just pretty much everybody I've read says that problem. And that's what we've got. We've got a few individuals, right? And more, which is great. But we still have the bulk of the cultures, the mass body of how a societies operate. For the most part, I'm generalizing, of course, are not at the level of where we need to be at fearlessness. Fearlessness, by definition, is it, just to get back to that, very simple, is when less than 50% of my decisions are motivated by fear. Less than 50%. Then we start to slip into the fearlessness development. More than 50% of my decisions are operated and motivated by fear, right? More and more what I would call immature stages of development compared to mature stages of development.
Next question is, the fear indigenous people exhibit towards nature is different from ecophobia, but the ritualistic performances of the state in the former times portray a kind of phobia wherein the people believe that misfortune may befall the family, community, if they fail to propitiate the deities through ritualistic performances. What is your take on this scenario?
Yeah, very, very large, complex issue to deal with. I will not be adequate at all, I'm sure, to address the complexities of it nearly, but I would say that we have to be very careful as moderns to how we interpret what is going on in earlier societies, indigenous societies, earlier history of our ancestors, and even how we interpret nature, animals, our ancestors of plants and animals, and how we interpret is very problematic, because I argued, as you saw in my slides, we are moderns, postmoderns. We are constructed with a self and a perceptual system that is primary in a culture of fear itself. That means our perceptual, emotional disposition is already projecting so much fear because we're raised in a culture of fear. That then when we look back, right, on others, or even try to analyze anything else, there's always a danger we're projecting. Oh, look how superstitious they are. Look how fear-based they are. Look at that. I suggest reading Desh Suba's book, The Philosophy of Fearism, is a very interesting challenge. He comes from a tribal culture. I think he didn't learn the alphabet till he was 17. He lived in a rural agricultural, very remote area of Nepal. But when he writes about fear, he says, basically his analysis is, as consciousness has developed over time, we have more fear, not less, than our earlier ancestors. In other words, we're more fear-based. Now, we may think, oh, we're not superstitious, like they are about this or something in nature, that they have these superstitions, they have to appease the gods and the pantheon of various threats. Now, I'm not saying there isn't fear. I'm not saying they can at times be fear-based. Yes, no doubt. If you have multiple traumas in those early indigenous kinds of cultures, civilizations, constant volcanoes, constant weather problems, right? Drought, starvation. These are massive scale traumas. Those affect cultures, indigenous cultures. But what in my study, and I have actually done in-depth study on indigenous worldview compared to a dominant worldview, right? As I talked about earlier, cooperative cultures versus dominator cultures. These prior participatory cultures, they do not have the same kind of fear, toxic fear, in accumulation as we do as dominator, modern, and postmodern cultures. Now, again, that's a much more complex discussion, but I have written on the indigenous worldview perspective as a fearlessness perspective compared to a fear-based perspective that you get in the dominant worldview. So I'm just saying, yeah, I'm not saying any ideal paradisical cultures and civilizations, indigenous peoples live that way, but I would argue their worldviews, even though we may interpret them as being, quote, fear-based, the argument might be, and it's a challenging one, is, yeah, but those indigenous cultures, did not themselves, destroy their environments. Some did in some ways, but in general, they did not destroy their environment and threaten the entire global world, the ecological systems of the global world, as we have modern advanced peoples, so-called, have. So I think we have to really question what we interpret. Remy, your mic's off, yeah.
The recent Hollywood movies, specifically the Marvel superhero movies on saving the world, aren't these a kind of building a fear complex and distrust of the other?
Yeah, another complex question. I think they both they have a good side, of course, of celebrating the heroic in history, the importance of a virtue that some of their characters, world saviors characters, this is an ancient mythology. We're not going to get away from world saviors appearing. I guess the question I would put to that one is, I wouldn't trust Hollywood, number one, for producing anything that is based on fearlessness. So I'll start there. And why? Because Hollywood is produced as a structure, a narrative, as a culture itself, perpetuating an ideology and culture around the world, globally spreading it like a virus. It's built within a culture of fear. It's built within American culture and history. American culture and history is probably one of the most fear-based cultures, civilizations around in the world. And again, I'm generalizing. There's no doubt other ones that are. And again, it's not to blame. I hope you got from my talk, if I accuse something of being, or critique something of being fear-based, that is not a put down. If I was to put that down and try to make myself or my view better, I'm already operating in a fear-based deficit structure because I'm wanting to dominate. I'm wanting to be superior. So that's why a fearlessness perspective, or I called it in one of my slides, I didn't go into it, a fearless standpoint. We need a fearless standpoint theory to understand and operate from ethically, so we do not fall into that fear-based dominating worldview and attitude. So I'm putting Hollywood in the, what I would call a critical perspective. I wouldn't trust it to produce anything that's fearlessness based. However, that doesn't mean within the Hollywood movies, those narratives, I think they're important to analyze critically. How do they help us understand fear and move beyond fear and transcend it? But then I would say you can't just transcend fear, you have to heal fear. Because trauma is always involved in toxic fear accumulation. So you better have a healing perspective, a healing practice. It's not just about some kind of, heroic, huge bravado, right? And all that we can produce to look like we're defeating fear and the enemy. And that is a very low level fear management system. It's useful to a point, but as I said, there are many fear management systems above bravery and bravado.
Okay, Dr. Michael, can I ask you the last question?
Okay.
Yeah, I know we are short of time, but the last question. How would you comment on the authoritarian regimes that are essentially fear-inducing and their imposition of rules and regulations to restore environment? By Saloni Sharma.
Well, regimes, we'll call them dictator regimes. We could call them regimes that are ruled by the law of fear, not the law of love. As I go back to, again, the kinds of cultures that have evolved, the regimes of political regimes. Very interesting about regimes, the first use of the culture of fear when it was actually coined. And I think that's such an important term historically and for our consciousness as a collective, as a species. We moved just from having fears and a psychology and biology of fears to a moment when we labeled it culture of fears. Well, that actually was in the early 80s. Researchers went into the south part of Latin America, which had been dominated since the 50s, 60s, into the 70s, even a little bit in the 80s, by dictatorships, Chile, Argentina, and so on. And they had an interdisciplinary team come out from several different countries, but largely out of New York, social scientists and literary people, psychologists. They had several people. And they went in and studied after the regimes and asked people and interviewed them who lived in these dictatorship regimes. And what they started realizing is that basically fear was controlling, right, all of the behaviors, whether you participated in the regime and supported the regime, or even some of the resistance movements, even then, were often motivated by fear. And yet they found there was a resilience in people that seemed not motivated by fear, but by love and collectivity. And that was a positive side to what operates underneath, in the underground mostly, of dictator regimes. But that's what they basically started coining, a culture of fear, and the dynamics and effects that it has. So rules and regulations necessarily aren't bad, right? They're necessarily not fear-based. You could actually argue that they have an intelligence about our safety and security and risk, about our ability to cooperate when we're in large groups. It's complex when you have large groups of people that don't have all the same political views, cultural views, ages, etc. We're watching it with COVID. How it's so hard to manage a society to even follow the basic rules and regulations of a state to handle COVID. And there's reasons for that, because we're so complex. We're not all the same. We don't all interpret things the same. So managing under regimes of rules and regulations, I basically have a philosophy is, if you have too many rules and regulations, you're probably more fear-based than not. Right? It's kind of a point of excess. And it's a point when you start feeling that excess that you get a sense this is a dominating fear-based direction. And again, not blaming, it might be actually well-intended at some level. And one could be more skeptical about that or not in certain situations. But I'm not against, obviously governance, I think, is essential. And there's good governance, healthy, non-fear-based. That's what I would like to promote. Is there any governments in the world that are not fear-based? I don't think so. I don't think we're there yet.
Okay, Dr. Michael, thank you so much for making this session interactive. And I think we could get on to the formal session of proposing the vote of thanks. Thank you once again, Dr. Michael.
End of a very interesting session on fear and ecology. Thank you, Dr. Fisher, for that enlightening session. The way you traced your interest into the ecological from your boyhood days to the concerns and research you take up now was especially interesting. Thank you for drawing our attention to the precariousness of human existence in the context of ecological distress and fear, in the midst of the liberation that modernity promises. The different dimensions of fear that you pointed out, I'm sure, has aroused certain fears in the minds of our distinguished audience, which you have again so patiently addressed. Thank you so much for that informative session. May I now call upon Professor Susmitha Ann Varughese, convener of the lecture series, to propose the vote of thanks.
Good evening, everyone. We have come to the end of the first lecture in the International Lecture Series on Effacing a Culture of Extinction, Exploration of Green Philosophies and Representations. It's been a very fascinating and engaging lecture by Dr. R. Michael Fisher on Ecology and Fear, or Fear and Ecology. Dr. Fisher spoke on how fear becomes a foundational construct to understand human nature. He also pointed out different aspects of fear, the way to manage it, and how fear gets distributed and reproduced as human beings are raised in a culture of fear. Thank you, Dr. Michael Fisher, for the wonderful lecture and the interactive session. Dr. Varughese Matthew, the principal of our college, has been exceptionally helpful and supportive in organizing this international lecture series. Thank you, sir. Sorry that sir could not attend the lecture because of some technical issues. I take this opportunity to thank the head of the department, Dr. Ashley Susan Phillip, for the support and guidance she has extended to us in materializing this event. Thank you, ma'am, for your wholehearted support and dedication. The members of Dr. A.V. Varughese Memorial Trust are here with us this evening. My heartfelt gratitude to everyone. Without your help, this lecture series would not have materialized. I sincerely thank Dr. A.P. John, the member of Dr. A.V. Varughese Memorial Trust, for speaking a few words on the stalwart Dr. A.V. Varughese and Dr. A.V. Varughese Memorial Trust. Thank you, sir, for the felicitations. The relatives of Dr. A.V. Varughese is here with us today. Thank you for gracing this occasion with your valuable presence. I also thank the distinguished professors, former teachers, guests, research scholars, students, and alumni for your sincere participation in the lecture. I wholeheartedly thank the convener, Dr. Remy Cherian George, for putting her heart and soul into organizing this lecture series. We have been fortunate to be backed by a team of motivated and dedicated teachers. I sincerely thank Dr. Susan Thomas for comparing the session, Dr. Ranjit Joseph, Rahul N., and Tina T. Elizabeth, who were behind the hosting of this lecture on Zoom and YouTube, and all my dear colleagues in wholeheartedly supporting us in organizing this lecture. I also thank Sanju T. Soman, our 30C student, in designing the brochures of all the lectures. Once again, I sincerely thank all those who were instrumental in making the first lecture a great success. Hope you'll all join us tomorrow at 11 a.m. for the second lecture on climate fiction and eco-criticism by G.M. Pillai IAS, Founder Director General, World Institute of Sustainable Energy, Pune. Thank you and have a nice time.
We have come to the end of our first session. Thank you all for your patient participation. We look forward to hosting you tomorrow. Thank you.